I'm going to show you just some of the supplies that I use for watercolor painting. I don't have very many, but I do have enough, and it's enough for me. So I truly believe in having just a little bit of supplies, not a whole art supply store of supplies, because when you have so many supplies, you just have a lot of supplies and you don't know what to do with them. So I'm going to show you today some of my watercolor supplies. The first palette that I'm going to talk about is the John Pike palette. This is one of my favorites. It's not too big and it's not too small. I really like the way this palette is made. So this top you can use for mixing your paints. So there's a lot of space you can use to mix your watercolors. I'm going to show you, this is what it looks like. I like the way that this palette is set up. I like how the wells where you can hold your watercolor paint, I like the way that these are set up. The next one I will show you is the first watercolor palette that I started off with. This palette is pretty old. You can see it's kind of turning a little bit yellow. This is what I used when I first started painting in watercolor. This is a plastic. It's not as durable of a plastic as the John Pike palette, but it works. So this is, like I said, just like the John Pike palette, this has a lot of space for you to mix your watercolor paints. And the wells on this palette are just a little bit different. They are not shaped the same. And it also, these wells go all around the watercolor palette. Some people like this, some people don't. But this is a good palette too. So this is my first watercolor palette, and it's a little bit shinier than the John Pike palette. But this is a great one. This is called the Jones palette. The next one I'm going to talk about is my portable watercolor palette. This one is great for travel. It's great for if you have to paint really quickly, or if you just want to, you know, hurry up and just do something and not bring out all your supplies. So this one is great. I'm going to open this up and I show you. I have some watercolor already mixed on here because I've used this frequently. So this one I like, it folds. But yeah, this one has a little area where you can put your thumb, where you can hold it like this. I particularly don't use it, but it's pretty helpful if you wanted to use it to hold it if you're going outside to do some plein air painting. I like to use Arches watercolor paper. This is called a watercolor block. This particular one is a hot press paper. I like hot press paper the best. A lot of people tend to use the cold press or the rough paper. But I particularly like the hot press. It's just something about it that I just like. So I like to use Arches hot press paper, and it's like in a pinkish color. The next one is the cold press paper. And I also like cold press paper. I like hot press a little bit better, but I also use the Arches cold press paper. So this one just has a little bit more texture, whereas the hot press is a little bit more smooth. I kind of like the smoothness of the paper. That's just me, my personal thing. I like smooth paper. So yeah, this cold press paper has a little bit more texture to it. So I also use, for coming up with different ideas, I use from Blick Art Supply Store. I have the Blick Studio watercolor paper. This paper I use to come up with my designs for my floral paintings. This one is a larger size watercolor paper. This, I believe, is 11 by 15, and it's not a block, it's a spiral bound. So the difference, the block watercolor paper, you don't have to tape it. It won't buckle because it is glued together on all sides, and at the top it has a little area where you can stick like I use like a gift card to separate the paper when you're ready to take it out off of the block. Another thing I'm going to talk about is the brushes that I use. I don't have a lot of brushes. Most people that I know, most artists probably have about 4 or 5 jars of brushes. But to me, this is just the jar that I have. So I have a Hick brush. That's a good brush to use. And I have this one, it's from Grumbacher. It's a 1.5 inch. It's like a wash brush. If you want to using large areas to paint. I have this brush, Cotman Winsor & Newton. This is a mop brush. I have Princeton Snap brush. This brush was very inexpensive. So most of the brushes I have are not very expensive. The only brush that I have that's a really expensive brush is this Winsor & Newton Professional Watercolor Sable. Sable seems to hold more water when you're painting, so those are more quality brushes. This is a size 10, so this is one of the best brushes I have. And let's see, the next one, this is a Robert Simmons Sapphire, and this is a sable and synthetic brush mix. So this, to me, I like this brush a lot. So this is a size 14. And this one is a Utrecht Squirrel 3/4 inch brush. This one I like a lot too. This one I use quite a bit. So these brushes in here are the brushes that I use most of the time. I also have the flat brushes, which I like. This is a Princeton 3/4 inch flat brush. And this one is a Princeton round brush, number 10. So different companies, different manufacturers of the brushes will produce different sizes. So these two are both size 10, but they look very, very different. So you could buy one brush from one company and it'd be a size 10, and another brush from another company and it'd be a size 10, but they will look totally different. So yeah, so I like to use a lot of round and flat brushes. So this brush I believe is a Princeton, and it's got a little rubbery grip to it, so it's easier to hold on to. And let's see, some of the brushes I use, this one is like I use for masking fluid. The tip is a little bit like, it's got a lot of masking fluid on it, but this is what I use to put my masking fluid on. Some of these brushes I brought for like $1. They're just brushes, like little thin brushes for me to do some like detail. They work just fine. So this, let's see. So yeah, these are some of the brushes that I use. Like I said, I don't have very many brushes, and it really helps me to not have too many supplies, because then I won't get painting. So this is my brush collection. And I will also show you some of the other things I use. I use Winsor & Newton colorless masking fluid. So this one, some of them come in yellow, some of them come in like a tinted color, blue color, but this one is a colorless masking fluid, and I like this one a lot. So this is Winsor & Newton colorless masking fluid. And those of you who don't know what masking fluid is, it is just a fluid that you put on so that you don't, if you want to paint over something, you can peel it off. Well, once you're done painting, you can peel it off and the area will still be white. So if you need areas on your paper to be white, you paint the areas that need to be white with the masking fluid. And once you're done, after you're done with your watercolor, you peel the masking fluid off. So that's what this is good for. I also have a spray bottle that I use. And this is just a spray bottle that I had around the house, like a hairspray bottle. It's just an Aveda hairspray bottle, but this works just great for me. I also use a washcloth. Anytime I'm painting and I need to wipe my brush off, I use my little washcloth. You can see it's got a lot of paint on there. So yeah, these work good, and these are handy for me. They were only like 50 cents or $1 at the dollar store. So that's what I use a lot. I also use a toothbrush. You can use a toothbrush to get the speckle effect. So all you do is just dip your brush in the watercolor and just kind of splatter it on the paper, which will give you something like the splatter texture that I have. So yeah, you can use a toothbrush. This is just a regular toothbrush that I had around the house. And it'll help you get splattery effects. All you do is just kind of tap the toothbrush or you can, you know, use your finger. Just get creative, and this will let you give you this splatter design. And I also use gift cards around the house that I found. I use these to scrape off some of the watercolor paint. Like when I'm painting and I need like, not a white area, but more of a lighter area, I use to scrape off. Like if you're doing trees and you need some branches or something, you can scrape off with the side of the gift card. So yeah, these gift cards, don't throw them away, use them. These are good for using with your watercolor paintings. I also use just a number 2 pencil when I do my, this is just a Dixon Ticonderoga. When I do my sketches, I'll use this pencil to sketch it out, and then a kneaded eraser. I also, another thing I forgot to mention about my watercolor palettes is I use a plate. I get this from the dollar store. I think this is porcelain or some kind of ceramic, but this was only $1, and this was this can be used as a watercolor palette. So go to the dollar store, pick up a couple plates, and you can use them as your palette. And you can also just put some saran wrap on top to save your paint. So you really don't even have to spend a lot of money on watercolor palettes. You could just go to the dollar store and pick up this $1 plate, a regular white plate. I also use a sponge to create different effects. You just dip your sponge in the watercolor paint and then dip it on your paper. So you can pick up different sponges at craft stores or anything like that. I also use artist tape. This tape is what I use if I'm not working with the watercolor blocks that I showed earlier that holds your watercolor paper down so that the paper doesn't buckle. So yeah, use artist tape to tape your paper down to a hard surface. I also use, here are some of the watercolor paints. I like to use Daniel Smith watercolors, and I also use Winsor & Newton watercolors. I also have a variety of Blick watercolor, and I have M. Graham watercolor. I also use, well, here are some of my Winsor & Newton watercolors. These are like, they have new packaging now, but these are like the old style packaging. So these are what I use too. I like the tube watercolor paints. So yeah, these are what I use. I've had these for a long time. So these professional grade, I like to use professional grade paints because I like to look at a nice painting. I don't want my colors to fade or anything like that. So I particularly tend to use a professional. You're gonna pay a little bit more, but you're gonna have a better result. So if you're gonna paint something that you're gonna wanna see years and years from now, I suggest using professional grade paints. They're gonna be a lot more quality. So you might spend a little bit more, but these are great. And I also use a mixing pan for my watercolors. I usually use a glass jar, kind of like what I'm using for my brushes, or I use one of these little accordion watercolor containers. So they fold up. These are great for travel. Great for you to take with you if you're on a trip and you just want to pack something very light. These are great because they just fold up, and all you got to do is open them up, add your water, and you're all set to go. Another thing I will mention is, according to paper, I use a sketchbook. Sometimes I use my watercolors in my sketchbook. So I don't use it very heavily, but I use a light wash of watercolor in this sketchbook paper. This paper is very thin, and it's a smooth paper, but this is also something else that I use for painting. These are just sketches that I use for painting watercolor that I use. So yeah, those are my supplies, and I hope you enjoyed this review of my art supplies for watercolor painting. I will come back with some more videos on some of the other supplies that I have, but for now, I'm going to show you just my minimal supplies, and thank you for watching.